Thank you for having me. Working on the Don River is something that everyone at MBVA is incredibly passionate about, so being able to come here and speak to the people who live in this city with this river is a real pleasure, and I really appreciate being able to share some of our observations and our work with all of you. So Nina Marie Lister already used this slide, but I love this image, so I was really happy to see it. When I see this image, I look at this and I think about the way that natural systems are the source of why a city exists. People come to water, that's what they need, that's how they live. And then I see in this how cities grow off those systems and rebuild them differently because of the way the city needs to grow. And then I see the question of, what do we do next? Because you get to a point where you can't go back and you can't continue on the path that you're already on, so what do you do? And I think that Corktown Common is one answer to that question about what do you do next. I'm going to talk a little bit about what allowed this project to be what it is, because there's the immersive experience, which is so much what it's about and what I think we hope people take away from it. But there's also a whole level of how does a project like this happen? And this morning, Jennifer Kiesmat talked a little bit about that. How do you make projects like this happen? It takes politics, it takes empowered citizen groups, it takes empowered city agencies, it takes money, it takes vision. It takes a desire to create an experience in a place. So these things are happening here in Toronto, and I don't think they're happening everywhere else in the world. And so there's a really interesting mix that happens right here. So we have to start with the Don River, which everyone's been talking about. The Don River is beautiful in everyone's memory. It was the site of a major freshwater marsh, one of the largest in North America, which also meant that it was a place of incredible diversity and naturalization. And you can see where Corktown Common is just up there at the mouth of the river. It's a place that the people of Toronto have always loved. They've loved the mouth of the river, they've loved the lakefront, they've loved to recreate, and even after the railway lines were built, people still crossed those rail lines to get here. And it's a place that, because of fear of disease and the need for industrialization, it's a place that was filled and channelized. And this is about, the needs of city development, industrialization, and as cities grow. So I've also always found this slide really interesting, where you can see the overlay, and I think others have shown this also, but the way you can see how the city is laid over the landscape, and how actually the landscape, while it's been engulfed by the city, is still influencing the way the city has grown. You can see how Cherry Street follows the spit of land that went all the way south, and the two are not divorced. And I think no matter how they each change, they're never divorced. So, again, what do you do next? And this again comes back to what happens here in Toronto. The ability to plan at a watershed scale, when you're looking at landscapes, the same way you plan cities at large scales, landscapes work at landscape scales. And to have the ability to look at a watershed scale and work at that scale means there are totally different opportunities available. So in 1946, conservation authorities were created within the province of Ontario. And I think that this is an incredibly interesting story, that the conservation authorities were taking a cue from the New Deal in the US, where they saw people getting to work, but there were private citizens here who saw that there was deforestation going on and people needed jobs, and they cared about their landscapes. And this came out of the communities, which is an incredible thing, that it was community driven. That moment paves the way for where we are now, because it created somebody who had authority over an entire watershed. Once there were conservation authorities, and then there was Hurricane Hazel, there became the TRCA, a conservation authority for Toronto. And again, this is the authority which oversees flood protection and naturalization for the Don River, and which of course is the basis of Corktown Common. So the role of Corktown Common, on the one hand, it's an important neighborhood park, but at its most elemental, the reason for being is that it is a piece of flood protection infrastructure. So on the left, you can see what the flood situation was, and on the right, you can see what the proposed solution is. And that little orange dot, that little 16-acre dot, is able to protect 210 hectares of land from flooding, which is quite an amazing thing. And that could have been enough in some ways, but not really, because this is what it would have been. A flood protection landform is a clay core covered in compacted fill, and it's right in the middle of the city. I guess maybe not the middle, but it's within the city. So these are the views from where the FPL was built, looking down Front Street and then looking across the river. And these become the opportunities for city making. It's not just infrastructure, but it's a place in the city. So One of our major design goals here was to make it feel a place apart, but also within. Taking the design and making a major lawn at the edge of Front Street, looking down towards the city, taking advantage of all the views, looking across the river, borrowing the view over to the landscapes on the other side of the river. Sort of simple, create height. It's not something that there is a lot of in the Portlands because it's fairly flat, and suddenly all sorts of different things open up. And not only do you have variations in topography, but because you have variations in topography, there are variations in experience, and there are diverse landscape habitats, which again, make it more and more nuanced. So this one's sort of a mouthful. Landscape as an embodiment of Toronto's social, political, and economic values. And I sort of hit on this a little earlier. We kept trying to pare it down, but I think this is really what I mean, honestly, that this place is a result of these pieces coming together, that the politics, the creation of watershed planning, waterfront Toronto, the way the city has supported this, that political commitment is essential to doing projects that are infrastructure, that are city building projects. The economic values of the city, the vision of city planning, the idea of leading with landscape, the faith that you could have to build a park and not build the city around it and know that it will believe that it'll bring people there, that takes a big leap of faith, but you have to have a place that believes in it and will support it. And then the social, I have never worked in a place where there's such a strong democratic feeling of community, and I mean that in the most positive sense, where the people who are part of the stakeholder groups are incredibly passionate, and it means that they own these places. They are part of all of the public meetings. They have a voice. The voice matters. The voice matters in a legislative way, which is incredible. And then they come around afterwards and they take ownership of the places that are created. And that, like, these three things mixed together really make for opportunities in placemaking and city building that are not found in other cities. So leading with landscape, there's the park, done. You can't get to it from Front Street, but you can get to it from the bikeways. And people, every time I would come here after the park opened, people would say how much they loved it. But there's nothing built around it, and you can't get to it very easily. And that really talks about this idea of the faith in the landscape and moving forward with it first as the thing that brings everything else along. The community input and commitment, which I already mentioned, of course, a very passionate community and stakeholder group and a very passionate agency group. And this image is not of the people who were giving input, but of the friends groups who have come in and stepped into place to help take care of this place now that it's up and running. And it reflects the things that they wanted. We sort of built their home. We built this for the citizens in the neighborhoods who are going to use this place. We talked about the Ashbridge's Bay Marsh, and it's along a major migratory bird route. So this is one of the conversations that came out of the community discussions, that if there's going to be a landscape returned here, it should respond to this condition. So one thing that became important there was creating a diverse habitat for all of these birds and plants that you need. So I don't expect you to read any of this. The point is that it's like a lot of numbers and a lot of colors. And in this fairly small 16-acre site, we have 17 distinct planting zones. And 95% of the plant palette is native or native adapted. This came out of a community desire, but it also creates a really diverse kind of place. This is the freshwater marsh, which oddly enough is built on top of, well, I guess I'll get to that, but it's a complete fabrication. It's built on top of something that doesn't drain at all on a flood protection landform. So it's this sort of like odd back and forth between what's real and what's created and how they go together. And then it's not just about birds and plants. This is a landscape that is built for people and built for communities. And out of the community discussions, there were specific things that people wanted. They wanted places to play where they could come together. And they wanted to have an immersive landscape experience where they could get lost in the city. And they wanted places to gather together, which when we talk about city living, that's one of the things that landscapes are all about. It's a place where people can get out of their little apartments where they don't have backyards and they can be part of a group. And it's a piece of a much larger network. It's a piece of the ravine network. It's a piece of the lower Donlands. It's a piece of the Portlands. It's a piece of everything that moves west in the city through the distillery and David Crombie Park. And then, it's the experience and a working landscape. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that this landscape does. A brownfield site, a toxic brownfield site, which had to be capped. It's a piece of flood protection infrastructure, which I've mentioned already. So it's doing these two sort of important jobs. And what does that mean for when you build a landscape here? It means a lot of things that no one ever sees, but become the linchpin for making it function the way it needs to function. So all these like little blue lines on the left of the red, that's all of the stormwater piping that you need. And if you notice, there's nothing on the east side of the red because that is the wet side of the flood protection landform. Everything east can drain. Everything west, we're keeping water out. So we had to actually treat this giant landscape like a green roof, where the water came in, it didn't leave, you have to reuse it. And if you want to have wetlands and water play features and a well-irrigated landscape in a place where you can't infiltrate any water, it becomes a much more complicated technical conversation. One that actually becomes an excuse for doing some very interesting things. So water comes in, kids play in it, it drains into a perched marsh, and then it goes to an irrigation cistern. In the summer, when the kids are playing a lot, that's when the marsh needs the most water. So the marsh was sized based on the amount of play we thought there would be. So there's this ecological and social balance. And if the kids don't play, then the marsh is starving, and we have to feed it from the city. So far, there've been enough play. And just so you can begin to see how the section works, there's all of this happening above a cap, above clay liners, and all very carefully tuned so you get a variety of habitat types. And then here you can see the way the different pieces work. So this is the water line coming up to the water play area. And then the water, after the kids play, going down to it gets UV filtered, it goes to the marsh where it's further cleaned and polished. And then it goes into the irrigation cistern. So it goes through overflow weirs. So, what else? There's a lot of other park areas that are not being fed purely by play water. So there's rain, and then there's the irrigation system. It goes to the free draining soil, and then back for irrigation, and it becomes a real closed loop. And until the water evaporates, that's what it's doing. And of course, this requires a very complicated system of under drainage so that we don't lose any of it. So in addition to the water, we are built on these massive pieces of infrastructure which are in place to protect a large part of the city. So there's the flood protection landform. And the flood protection landform is monitored through settlement monuments by TRCA to make sure that nothing's moving. So it's built on something that has to be stable. It's not just another piece of landscape. And then on top of that, we have a capped brownfield site, so there are monitoring wells all over the place. And then there's the pond liner and monitoring wells for that to make sure that we're not seeping water through the FPL. And then even within the pavilion that's built quite a ways above the FPL, there are more monitoring vents. And so that was all the technical stuff of the park, but when you're there, it's a place for the community. It's a place to be in the environment. It's an immersive experience. And this is what you see. Kids playing, families getting together. But it's in the city, and it's right there. People gathering, and then a place just to be and something that you wouldn't find anywhere else in the city. Thanks.